Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to another session. I'm so excited to have you here this afternoon. I'm going to go ahead and introduce us to or at least acknowledge the series that we're in, and then we'll talk a bit more specifically about today's session. So I'm welcoming you today to the CAAASA UCLA CCEE Advancing Equity in an Era of Crisis webinar series. The California Association of African American Superintendents and Administrators, CAAASA, and the University of California, Los Angeles Center for the Transformation of Schools put this project together to support equity in virtual learning as we all shelter in place to prevent the spread of COVID-19. This work has been made possible by the generous support of the California Collaborative for Educational Excellence, CCEE. We are grateful for their partnership on behalf of California's K-12 public school students. So there are those of you who are here today for the live session, and we're so excited to have you here. At the end of today's session, I'm going to send you the link in the chat to a survey that you can complete to evaluate our time together. We would greatly appreciate it if you would fill out the survey. I know you probably get a ton of surveys. We really appreciate your feedback so that we make sure that these sessions continue to meet your needs. And if you're watching a recording of this session, you still have access to that survey, so we'd appreciate your feedback as well. You'll also be receiving from me, because we are so, it's really imperative to us that your questions and comments are considered. We'll have time for you to submit questions today during the session, but if you have other questions that arise for you after today's session, or there's a question that you don't get answered, you'll also receive a link at the end to our Ask the Experts portal. I'll send that link to you at the end of today's session so that you'll be able to submit your questions, and then you'll be receiving answers to those questions within 48 hours. And then finally, what I want to say is that you will be receiving also the link to the website where today's session resources will be available, the recording and the slide presentation. And then the other piece too, as far as collaborations, that we really want to make sure that not only are you submitting your questions for today's facilitators, you are a wealth of information and support to one another. So please, if you have resources that you want to share or comments that you want to share with one another, please make sure when you submit your comment or question in the chat that it says all panelists and all attendees, so that everyone can see the wonderful things that you have to say. So now today, just talking specifically about today's session, we have the privilege of being with Lybroan James and Ann Watkins. Lybroan is the Chief Educational Officer at STEMulate Learning, LLC, yes?
Yes, that's right.
Because it hasn't listed, I'm just like, I hope I'm saying the right thing about the right person, right? So that's Lybroan. And then Ann is the Consultant and Senior Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And today's session is called System Design. How do we ensure that we serve children who have been historically disadvantaged? So I'm gonna pass the mic over to the two of them, and I'll be here monitoring the chat, and then I'll close this out at the end. And Lybroan and Ann, you can take it away.
Thank you, Africa.
Thank you very much, Africa. I want to welcome everybody to our third webinar today, delivered by Ann and myself. And before we get started, we wanted to know just how many people have participated in some of our other webinars. The first webinar we did was the Introduction to Equity, where we talked about creating a definition of equity and discussed different ways in which equity needs to be increase in the public school education system. And then in the second webinar, it was titled Unconscious Bias, and led us in speaking about dealing with the concept of unconscious bias and how it is prevalent in education, and strategies we can use to be more self-aware of our biases and to try to not use them in the context of school, or to avoid biases when dealing with students. And so if we can put up the first poll, Africa, we just want to get a poll to see if someone can figure out, have you attended both of our sessions before, or maybe one, or none at all, just so we'll know the context for our group today. All right. Did you launch that one? I see
Yes.
it on, oh, you launched it. Okay, all right, fantastic.
Yep. Are you all able to see the numbers coming up?
No, we can't.
Okay.
Yeah.
So right now it says that we have 58% of the folks who have voted. The option on the bottom says the end poll, but if I end the poll, is it going to show you what the?
Yeah, so we'll just wait till it gets to about at least 70%, and then
Okay.
And then you can share the poll.
Okay. All right, we're at 70%, so I'll go ahead and.
Okay, go ahead and share the poll.
Okay, share the results. Okay, you can see it now?
Yep.
Okay, cool.
So what does it look like to you, Ann?
Yeah, it looks to me like there's sort of most people hadn't participated or viewed any of the our past
Right.
two at this point, but a number have done both. So we're kind of all over the place.
Exactly. So we'll talk somewhere in the middle, Ann. like they've never heard it and like they've heard it all before, right?
Exactly.
All right, if you could just do list the second poll now so we can see just who's in the room with us today in terms of teachers, parents, and administrators.
Okay.
If you could post that one, that'd be great. Thank you.
Okay, I just posted that one. And so I'll do the same thing.
Okay.
When it's 70%, I'll share it.
Yes, perfect.
Okay.
All right, Carla, I see that counselor. Okay, I guess you'll be clicking other. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, teacher and a parent. We need to add that one next time. If you're multiple. Thank you so much for that one.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and share it now because we're at 70.
Yep.
Okay.
All right, fantastic. So the majority are teachers, and we have our paraeducators, school admin, and others. I know some counselors. So that is fantastic. Now that we know who's in the room, who's seen us before, and who hasn't, we can go ahead and get this party started.
All right.
Oh, let's go for it.
Yes. All right. So first, we want to begin by sharing the outcomes for today. One, we want to provide a historical context for the inequities in the education system. So it's important to know what has happened in the past so that we can better understand the situation today. And so once we look at a few key historical moments, it'll start to create a context for what's happening today and the things we can do to improve things for tomorrow. Also, we want to look at the structures and policies that perpetuate inequalities in the school system. A lot of the barriers happen to be policies that are in place. And surprisingly, a lot of them are just traditions that have developed and just ways of being. There's no rhyme or reason, just sort of traditions and norms that have been created that have created inequitable situations. And so we want to be able to identify those as well. And then lastly, we want to explore, this is our favorite part, right, Ann? We want to explore how we can disrupt and interrupt the current educational system in order to create more equitable outcomes and opportunities for all students.
Okay, so actually, I'm going to be just saying hello and just letting you all know how glad I am you're here. That my background, my history, and how I think of myself often, particularly today, was that I was a history teacher, high school. And so when I think about the importance of understanding history, that sort of resonated particularly with me today. But actually these agreements, we call them 4 agreements for courageous conversations, come from Glenn Singleton, who wrote a book called Courageous Conversations about Race. And he has these and a couple of other pieces of his protocol that really help us to have the conversations, because if we can't have the conversations, we're not going to make any progress. And as you can see, it's speaking your truth. And we're hoping, even given we have this context where not everybody has a chance to talk, that there'll be opportunities for you to do that. We invite you to stay engaged, to know that sometimes it's uncomfortable to have conversations, to be okay with it. And last of all, to expect and accept non-closure. And actually, Lybroan last night had a conversation with Glenn Singleton, who he discovered was a fellow fraternity brother.
Fraternity brother, right, exactly, yes.
but that's for another conversation when we can have our virtual wind down.
Exactly. And so,
go ahead.
No, I was saying one thing I want to add to the 4 agreements is that when people speak their truth, one of the suggestions that I received is that you begin your sentence by saying, in my experience. So if you talk about your experience, no one can argue your experience, and that is your truth rather than the absolute truth. And so it's really easier to have those conversations. And I suggest that we also use these 4 agreements when working with students online, because it's really hard many times for students to stay engaged. And if the rigor is high, or instructions may not be completely clear, like if you verbalize instructions rather than putting them on a PowerPoint, kids can easily be disengaged. So it's really important to share these with students in the learning environment and understand that they are going to experience discomfort. And as educators, we have to understand that they're going to have that discomfort, and we have to be aware of that during the learning process. Go ahead. Yeah. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, that's okay. And I just would like to ask everybody to think about just maybe one that they want of these 4 that they want to be more aware of as we go through our webinar today. So choose one just to sort of keep in your mind. That would be really helpful for us. All right. So we're going to actually right now sort of clarify this notion of systemic inequity and racism. And I wanted to also encourage those people who didn't get to see our past 2 webinars, mine and Lybroan, to go to the archives, because they're there, and we encourage and invite people to look into the ones that we did on unconscious implicit bias. But as you watch this very short video, we want you to think individually of ways you've either benefited from or been denied by the system of inequity and racism. So let's play the video.
All right, let me go ahead and share this. One second here. Once again, I have to make sure that I put share the sound. I learned that from last time. Here we go. So now, one second here, and I'll get this screen situated. One second here. There we go.
This is Jamal. Jamal is a boy who lives in a poor neighborhood. He has a friend named Kevin, who lives in a wealthy neighborhood. All of Jamal's neighbors are African American, and all of Kevin's neighbors are white. Because Jamal's school district is mostly funded by property taxes, his school is not very well funded. His classrooms are overcrowded, his teachers are underpaid, and he doesn't have access to high-quality tutors or extracurricular activities. Kevin's school district is also funded by property taxes, so his school is very well funded. His classrooms are never crowded, his teachers are very well paid, and he has access to high-quality tutors and lots of extracurricular activities. Kevin and Jamal live only a few streets away from each other. So how come they're growing up in such different worlds with such different opportunities for success? The answer has to do with America's history of systemic racism. To understand it better, let's look at what life was like for Kevin and Jamal's grandparents. Decades after the Civil War, many government agencies started to draw maps dividing cities into sections that were either desirable or undesirable for investment. This practice was called redlining, and it usually blocked off entire black neighborhoods from access to private and public investment. Banks and insurance companies used these maps for decades to deny black people loans and other services based purely on race. Historically speaking, owning a home and getting a college education is the easiest way for an American family to build wealth. But when Jamal's grandparents wanted to buy a house, the banks refused because they lived in a neighborhood that was redlined. So Jamal's grandparents were not able to buy a home, and because colleges could prevent them from attending through legal segregation, their options for higher education were really scarce. Kevin's grandparents, on the other hand, got a low-interest loan to buy their first house and got accepted into a handful of top universities, which traditionally only accepted white students. This opened up a wealth of opportunities that they were able to pass on to their kids and grandkids. Even as late as the 1980s, an investigation into the Atlanta real estate market showed that banks were more willing to lend to low-income white families than to middle or upper-income African-American families. As a result, today, for every $100 of wealth held by a white family, black families have $5.04. A 2017 study confirms that redlining is still affecting home values in major cities like Chicago today. This explains how Kevin and Jamal inherited vastly different circumstances. Unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. A big part of systemic racism is implicit bias. These are prejudices in society that people are not aware that they have. Let's go back to Kevin and Jamal. Against all odds, Jamal manages to be the only student from his high school to get accepted into a great university, the same one that Kevin and his high school friends are attending. But after Kevin and Jamal both graduate, Jamal notices that his resume isn't drawing as much interest as Kevin's, even though they graduated from the same program with the exact same GPA. Unfortunately for Jamal, studies show that resumes with white-sounding names get twice as many callbacks as identical resumes with black-sounding names. Implicit bias is one of the reasons why the black unemployment rate is twice the rate of white unemployment, even among college graduates today. You can see evidence of systemic racism in every area of life. The disparities in family wealth, incarceration rates, political representation, and education are all examples of systemic racism. Unfortunately, the biggest challenge with systemic racism is that there's no single person or entity responsible for it, which makes it very hard to solve. So what can you do? The first thing you can do is work towards becoming more aware of your own implicit biases. What are some prejudices that you might hold that you're not aware of? Second, let's acknowledge that the consequences of slavery and Jim Crow laws are still affecting access to opportunity today. As a result, we should support systemic changes that create more equal opportunities for everyone. Increasing public school funding and making it independent from property taxes would be a great start, so that poor and wealthy districts can receive equal access to resources. Systemic problems require systemic solutions. Luckily, we're all part of the system, which means that we all have a role to play in making it better. Peace.
Wow, thank you. And that pretty much
wraps it up.
Yep.
Anyway, okay, so we'd like actually at this point to invite you, the next slide, when LeBron gets a chance to put it up real quick, to really be thinking about the first prompt, which was, how have we benefited or how have we been affected negatively by this? And the other thing that we wanted you to think about a little bit was this notion that it is, there's not a one single person or entity responsible, so it makes it even more hard to solve. So I'd like to invite a couple hands to be raised. And LeBron, are you able to see those?
Yes,
and also, if anybody in Africa, if you want to look into the chat and see if people are giving some thoughts, give you guys a chance to sort of respond to this video and this notion of how it's been historically a part of our culture and our system.
And while we wait for people to raise their hands, and it's funny because I feel like when I saw the redlining, what dawned to me is there's redlining in terms of schools as well.
Exactly.
I remember when I came back from graduate school, I was going to start a charter school for Black and brown boys around mathematics. And if you were east of Crenshaw Boulevard, which means you were deep in the hood, there was a Walton family grant. You could get a $200,000 or $300,000 grant to start your charter school. But if you were on the west side in the white area, LA, you couldn't get that same grant. So what happens is you had all these charter schools, hundreds, all started in the same area in the inner city, because that's the only way they can get their grants. And then those schools struggle to have students because it was too many schools for that population, but they made sure they kept them away from the west side. So that was a form of redlining I see. Oh, I see. We have a hand up here. I'm going to let Irene speak here.
It's a great example, Lybroan.
1 second, Irene. This is not letting me. So, and that was, so there's a lot of different ways and things we see where when we deal with that. So we won't be, let's look into the chat right now because it's not allowing us to pull up
Will the people have their hands raised? All right, so then Irene and Tirza, I'll encourage you to, if you're able to write your comment down in the chat, and then I'll be able to give voice to it. So the first, going back to the comments, in my experience, reading the book, The Color of Law is very powerful. It made it so glaringly clear the redlining happening for decades in the 1920s and beyond. Someone else commented, busing was the biggest form of racism. I think about, especially, I mean, I wasn't here at the time, but living outside of Boston, wow. Well, we can go on for days about how that went in Boston. The hardest part is getting people to open their minds and accept that the system does not support everyone. School was originally set up to split those who would work in factories and those who would work in the business sector. Someone else had the courageous conversations about race protocol. I've known Glenn for over 25 years. His work informs my professional and personal work. Knowing that there is no single person or entity makes it even more important that we build community and institutional responses through organizing.
Thank you.
Right? Yes.
All right.
Thank you so much for that. Yes. And so those are the things we wanted to keep in mind, and please keep putting things into the chat. We're going to try to see if we can get more voices in the room. The technology is being technology right now. But like I said, when we ask, we'll have Africa read out more. So that'll be great. And so moving right along, now we want to look at the history and legacy of the anti-literacy law. So this is a historical piece we want to reiterate based on what we've seen in the video and understand the impact that if you as a race of people are not allowed to read for hundreds of years, and that you would be killed for trying to read, that has a systemic historical impact that reverberates over centuries. And so even though African Americans fought for the right to read, many of them lost their lives trying to read. So there's a large segment of the population who is literate, but the love of learning, books in the home, opportunities to have discussions, those are not historical norms in the Black community due to these historical laws that took place. And so to imagine, it was a law that they could not read. And so we really have to be aware of that in the context of what we're trying to do to increase the amount of equity now in schools. And so this is an incredible quote that Anne found for us. It says, once you learn to read, you will forever be free. And so reading is like the foundation of freedom. Because when you read, you open up your mind, as we all know. And so it reminds me, like my dad used to tell me as a kid, he goes, if you ever want to hide something from a Black person, put it in a book. And so that was a reference to the historical context that information has been hidden in books. And if you can't read, you can't organize. And so that's partly why it took so long for the emancipation and the freedom of Africans who were enslaved, because they knew if they learn how to read, they're going to understand, they're going to organize. And so my question now is, as we look at the literacy rates for ELL students, and why is that such a challenge? Because to me, it appears like there is some systemic thing happening where ELL students are not given the opportunity to improve their reading or to honor their language and create a bridge for them to understand English as well. And so I'm wondering if it's connected some way to this historical context here.
So the next thing that we wanted to just touch on really quickly is this notion of the Jim Crow laws, which were instituted after the 14th Amendment, after when slavery became illegal. And those were ways that were really intentionally perpetrated upon African Americans to keep them in a situation where they weren't able to be successful. And there were arrests, jail sentences, violence and death, and that visual of the Ku Klux Klan reminding us of that. Then these Jim Crow laws were regional and were there with the intention of keeping people of color from being successful and entering into the system. The next slide, which I think is so important, is these are pictures of three activists who fought against Jim Crow laws. And I think to myself, how many of us learned about these heroes, these activists in our schooling as we learned history? How many of us as teachers really are aware of these folks? Maybe we've heard a name like Ida B. Wells, who actually was an activist who owned her own newspaper and wrote articles against these laws. But many of us don't know the history of the activism and in the empowerment that people of color and Black people in particular took up, risking death and to fight against these injustices.
And so now we want to look at a couple of the landmark decisions by the Supreme Court that still have reverberating effects, namely Plessy versus Ferguson and Brown versus the Board of Education. And so as we look at these systematized inequalities, which means they were sanctioned by the government, that we have to understand that this was not that long ago and that we're still dealing with some of the repercussions. For example, the racial segregation in 1896. We've all heard separate but equal, but the way it was enforced was always separate but unequal. So there was unequal opportunities. And I know that for me, having studied in this period of time, what I realized is that separate was fine. As if you look at today is just as segregated as it was 200 or 300 years ago. And people live in their own community based on culture or religion or ethnicity, but the way resources are distributed are unequal. Opportunities in those different communities are unequal, and those are the things we're trying to address. And so looking at the Board of Education, Brown versus Board of Education, that created the situation for integrating schools. One of the challenges for that is that schools that were, say, all Black or Latino back then, they had teachers who looked like them. The teachers had higher expectations for them. They had more rigor. They had opportunities. I could be the school president. I could be captain of this team. So there's all these other aspects of learning in school that builds your self-esteem as well as your intellectual capabilities that were lost with integration. Because when you integrated, you had the teachers who may not have wanted you in the school. You had the other students. When you went and integrated to schools, a lot of times, I know you've seen the pictures where they had to have police escorts to go to school with guns because of the threat that you would be harmed or killed for going to an integrated school. And that is the history of America. And the part they really don't talk about most is that after Brown versus Board of Education, there was other legislation passed because what happened was white flight took place. So the white families left the city and went to the suburbs, and they left the public schools in the inner city for the Black and brown kids. So then in the late 60s and early 70s, there was a proliferation of private schools. So most private schools you'll see started in the late 60s and 70s as a backlash or an alternative to Brown versus Board of Education. So they understood that, okay, in public schools, they are forcing us to integrate. But if we create this thing called a private school and we make tuition high, then that's our way of keeping them out. And so, what someone told me once in a class is there was racism. And then to overcome the racism, they did Brown versus Board of Education. But then white people said, okay, we're going to do priceism. So priceism means if I charge $40,000 a year to go to this school, sure, you can come. It's open to everybody, but then you end up getting the same student body, segregated student body. So we have to be aware of a lot of these inequities systemically that have taken place.
And are still taking place. We're just touching briefly on affirmative action, which was an attempt to kind of level the playing field. And I'm just going to let Lybroan talk a little bit about it from his experience. The next slide talks a little bit, just gives you an idea of how the UC regents challenged affirmative action. And actually today or yesterday in the newspaper, there was an article that there's a lawsuit being brought against the UC system in regards to the SAT tests that are required, because they have found that those are inequitable. And so even today, just the impact that some of these efforts to keep people from being, people of color and Black folks from being part of the system. And so I'm going to let Lybroan just talk quickly about his own experience.
Yeah, and so I think affirmative action was pretty much at its height during my time of transitioning from high school to college. So I remember when I applied to college, when I got accepted to UCLA in the math department, that there were students, fellow students and parents at my school who were angry at me and thought that I took somebody else's spot when I got accepted to UCLA, and that I wasn't qualified, and that I only got into UCLA because of affirmative action. And without affirmative action, that I wouldn't have been able to get into the school. And so once I got to the campus, it was the same backlash. People I would meet, they would have this disdain for me and say, you took my friend's spot. And I'm like, how did I take your, I don't even know your friend. Like, you know, everyone gets admitted based on their own merits. And if I wasn't qualified, I would not have been admitted. So I came up with my own personal term to deal with this. So they said I got in because of affirmative action because I was Black. I said, well, you got in because of affordable action, because you're white and rich. So if you can afford to go to school, if you can pay tuition without financial aid, you have a higher chance of being admitted to the school. You don't have to work jobs if you have the money. So the affordable action, as we've seen from a few years ago with the college scandals, is another way in which people were getting in. So when they talked about affirmative action, I talked about affordable action. And, you know, and so what it created was a dampening of my self-esteem, because it was a feeling of I'm not as good as others because of how they perceived that I got in, not because of my academic ability, but because of this program called affirmative action. But what people fail to realize is there's no affirmative action to get out of college. You got to go through unconscious bias, racism, unequal treatment by professors to get through. So once you graduate, the affirmative action part no longer exists, because that was to get in, but to get out was a battle. And it was a battle for most people of color and for women, that once you're in, you're always trying to prove yourself and, you know, deal with the imposter syndrome often. And so we have to be mindful that these same things still happen in terms of education through K-12. So who is chosen to be in the honors classes? How's that determined? Who's allowed to be in AP classes and who's not? And so I see that all the time, especially with the identification of gifted students versus special ed. So we know that students of color are over-identified for special ed, but are under-identified as gifted. In fact, I just read an article in preparation for today that said that 80% of teachers are white women. And so their cultural view of what is intelligent is skewed in terms of identifying kids as being gifted. But what it shows is that white teachers identify white students as being gifted at about 30%, at a 30% rate. And ironically, teachers of color identify students of color as being gifted at about a 30% rate. So what's interesting that is more, I think it's less about the racism, but more about how you identify culturally with your student body. So I can see things in students of color because I understand language, the culture, and say, oh, I see some intelligence there. I think this student is gifted. Whereas a teacher who may not have that experience or background may not see those same things, or they have different cues to identify what is gifted. And so those are things we have to be aware of as well.
And that really does, thank you for sort of bringing that to the forefront, Lybroan, because that really does sort of go back to that notion of understanding the unconscious bias. And it's not something that people maybe can really speak about and articulate because it's something that is just so subversive and part of like Lybroan's college experience. It's not that somebody was intentionally doing it, but it just is, it's the world that you swim in. So I guess the next slide is where we're going next, and that is what can we do? Sometimes this just feels overwhelming. It feels like we've got so much, and I wanted to put up this quote from Enid Lee, who defined educational equity in terms that really are specific to what we're talking about today, which is altering current practices and perspectives to teach for social transformation. And transformation is the word that we have to keep in mind. And I feel, you know, I'm hopeful that with this pandemic and the impact that it has, I really feel that this would be a time when we can begin to think about transforming our schools. It's sort of a break, and I think this notion that we all have to be anti-racist, we have to be activists. We can't be passive in order to have any kind of transformation. So the next slide, did you want to say a couple things too, or?
No, I agree with that 100%. Yeah.
Okay, we're going to actually going to give you a chance to think a minute. I don't know if we're going to be able to hear voices. I hope so. But if not, Africa, maybe you can read some. But we wanted you to think about this notion of the role that each of us has to play in making it better. And I just would love to hear a few people talk about what they see their role is in trying to make this better.
Yeah, so we'll try once again. So if someone would like to speak, to go ahead and please raise your hand, and I'll see if we can get. Africa, do you have the ability to promote people from? Okay, so what if someone raises their hand, if you promote them to panelists, then they'll be able to.
Yep. Okay, I'll do that.
Yeah. So if anyone would like to share their thoughts about possible solutions or any feedback you had on our discussion so far, please raise your hand, and then we'll also look in the chat as well.
All right, so I have Gabriella.
For Gabrielle Mitchell.
Yep. Okay.
Yeah. Promote her to panelist and then allow her to speak. Mm-hmm.
Where did she go?
She's up. She's a panelist now. There she is. Go ahead, Gabriella. Can you turn on your camera and your unmute yourself, please, Gabriella?
Oh.
Just a second. Oh.
There, we hear you. We want to see you.
Yeah, I don't have a camera on this laptop. It's defective. Sorry.
That's all right. That's all right.
Okay, so I just wanted to share that I've done a case study on this in my master's program, and I really looked deeply into this. I really feel that we need to, hire more teachers of color. I think that that's a priority. And, there's a lot of, I'm of Black descent, but I'm also Hispanic. But I feel like we really covered a lot of, the Hispanic side, but we haven't hired enough Black teachers. So I think it's very important that we do that. I had an experience last year as a first grade teacher where I saw firsthand that my first grade student, he was only 5, was discriminated against because he has learning disabilities, to the point that it's caused a lot of issues because they were yanking on him and things like that, and the mom became aware of it. And so anyway, long story short, we need Black males, Black females as teachers, as counselors. We need them in our schools. And I think that this is going to help, I think, from the not the elementary, but the K through 12, but even in college, arena. So that's what I wanted to share.
Thank you very much. Thank you for sharing that. And so Africa, I think Lorraine Zapata is next. If you could bring Lorraine up as a panelist, and then we can allow her to speak.
Yeah, I'm trying. Let's see.
We can hear you.
Okay, sorry. Thank you guys. I think one of the roles that we have to play that is extremely difficult when you're dealing with unconscious bias is, as leaders at school, how are you communicating and making it okay to talk about race and inequities, and to do it in a way that you're not putting people on edge? Because what I find for myself is I have not mastered the calm way to handle extreme racism. I'm at a school that is extremely diverse, with almost 47% African American, 20 Hispanic, and about 20 Caucasian. But the overt racism that I see for my African American boys and girls, it's overt. And you're right, we have a system in place where we do have teachers from middle class who are ill prepared to deal with culture and poverty. And in addition to all of this, I'm smack in the middle of poverty. And so the needs that our kids have and the way to instill hope, but holding the adults on campus accountable for that in a manner that is that's solution oriented instead of accusatory. It's a dance, and you have to confront it head on. But you also have to be aware that if they don't want to change, you've got to do your part to force the change, because our kids are depending on us. I think the thing for me is that every time we have inequity that happens, our kids become less and less engaged, and they lose hope. And they are too young to lose hope. That's all I want to say.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lorraine, for that. And so I really appreciate that. And I mean, it's more confirmation, because the more we have this conversation and people like you, Lorraine, share, the more we understand that it's not our imagination, that this is really, really happening. And so we're going to try and take just a couple of more, maybe 30 seconds each. But while you're transitioning, Africa, I want to say to Lorraine that one of the reasons I started my company is because I said, I'm going to train white teachers how to teach math to Black and brown kids. And they're like, LeBron, why can't you just train them to teach math? I said, because it's ethnomathematics. I said, teaching and learning is cultural. So if you're teaching math from a culture that doesn't align with the students, it doesn't help their esteem, then you're missing the mark. And so while we need more teachers of color, every teacher needs to have a coach for cultural literacy, a coach for social emotional learning, a coach for growth mindset, so that when you leave that PD feeling good, when you go back to school Monday, your coach will be like, okay, now what are 3 things we can do to determine the culture of the students in this class? What are 3 things we can learn and include in the lesson this week, not next month or next year, this week? And so you need a coach to support you and to identify when you say things that may exhibit your unconscious bias, or may seem racist to someone else, or maybe a microaggression. And then your coach weekly can work with you on that in a non-threatening way. So that's one of the methods. But go ahead, Africa, let's take the next one. Oh, wait, Anne, do you
And
have
I
something to say?
just wanted to say one really quick thing. And as I was listening to the comment about how uncomfortable it is and how people don't want to have that conversation, that's where I find that some of the agreements of Glenn Singleton's protocol is really helpful. That you have to be open to feeling uncomfortable. Nobody likes to feel uncomfortable. We all like to feel good, and the truth of the matter is it's not comfortable for anybody to talk about this. That's why it hasn't been addressed. That's why it's been sort of underneath the carpet, if you will. So we're going to move to the next slide. And
oh wait, I'm sorry. Did you want Armina? Because
oh, I'm sorry.
one more
Yes, let's
Yeah,
have
we'll take our
one more
meeting.
person.
absolutely.
Oh. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
So I'm working in the capacity of an instructional coach. So the fact that he just said it continues, it's ongoing. It's not a one-shot deal, right? So working in coaching, I'm in Stockton Unified School District, a lot of things happening with us with equity. So with coaching, I try to use equity as meaning addressing the needs of all learners. But in order for you to address the needs of a learner, you have to understand who you're teaching. So in understanding who you're teaching, there needs to be some equity of voice. And so I'm really working hard with giving students a voice. So I've read Christopher Emdin's work, Reality Pedagogy. He focuses more on secondary, but I'm trying to translate that in the K-6, in the elementary range too, by using restorative circles. So students are giving a voice to how they're being instructed. Because even within culture, my age group compared to my children's and my grandchildren's age, there are some differences in that generation, even within the same culture, that need to be addressed. So it's not like some people get like this theory that they had in a class and they use it for the next 20 years. So we need to address who's in front of you at that time. So diving into that work, and again, there's a lot of things, good things that are out there that are already being done, but to take it right now, my goal is to try to look at that. What does it look like in K-6? Because if I have students that leave 6th grade going into middle school and they know how to advocate for themselves about their learning, I mean, that's the goal.
That's the goal. Thank you so much for sharing that. Thank you. And so we're going to continue on. Tirza and Polly, please keep your hands up because we're going to ask for more comments in a few minutes. But we're going to continue on with the presentation now. But keep those hands up. And do you have any thoughts about those solutions as well?
No, I just really appreciate people's voices thinking about their role, because that's what it gets down to, each one of us being active, not passive.
Exactly.
Take it away.
All right. And so now here's a framework that I want to share with everyone. And please remember that this PowerPoint will be uploaded so that you can have a copy of it. But this framework has helped me so much in my work. And so like when Lorraine said, you know, how do I address the racism? Or people say, we see it, but how do we, it's like air, like I feel it, but I can't see it, and it comes and goes, and how do I deal with it? So Bowman and Deal created these 4 frames, and I always look at schools through these 4 frames when I'm dealing with equity and issues of racism. One, I look through it through the human resources frame. So how do schools align teachers' needs with student outcomes? So in HR, are you hiring teachers who are proficient at teaching students of color? So it starts with the hiring. So I remember when I was going to start my own school, they said, LeBron, when you hire teachers for your school, because your school is going to have primarily Black and brown boys, here's the question you need to ask the teachers in the interview. Have you ever successfully taught a Black or brown boy before? Do you know anyone that has ever successfully taught a Black and brown boy before? Or have you read any research on how to effectively teach Black and brown boys? If they can't answer yes to one of those 3, you don't hire the person, period. So HR is where it really all begins. And then we also have the symbolic frame, looking at the school symbolically. How does that school represent the community? Is the mascot representative of the community? Is the colors representative of the community? Is the school model representative of the community? So typically, symbolically, you look at a school, it represents maybe the culture of the administration, but maybe not that of the student body. So you really want to look at the symbolic frame. And then next, we want to look at the political frame. Whose preferences and interests are to be served by the school? So whenever I've been taught to diagnose a school, the first thing I do is look at the mission statement. What is the mission statement and vision you have on your website and on the wall? Then I interview the students and say, students, do you feel like this mission statement is being lived up to by your school? And most often they're like, no, that's not what's happening in my classroom. I mean, it says all kids will be promoted and encouraged and equity of voice, and all kids will be shown how to be leaders. And they said, well, no one's ever asked me to lead. No one's ever asked me to speak up. And so the hypocrisy we see is always going to be through that political frame. What is the mission statement versus what is happening in the school? And that's one way we can make change. Like they said, look, I don't necessarily want you to change, you know, if people have unconscious bias or maybe practicing racism through a systemic framework, that you're in a systemic framework that's racist, and so you just operate in that existing system. All you really have to do is say, am I living up to what's written? Because they don't write racist terms. They write equity, truth, liberty, justice for all. Now, are you living up to that? And that's the question we have to keep asking. Are we living up to what is being written? And that's all we want you to do, is follow what's been written for the school in terms of the mission and the vision. And then lastly, it will be the structural frame. How do we organize the school? Who is it designed to meet the needs of? Is the school designed for the administration? Because if you look at the budget, if it's top heavy, you know the money is going to the administration. That's what it's about. Is it designed for the students? And if you want to know the structure design of a school, you can always believe in by the school schedule. If school said, oh, we believe that teachers should collaborate and there should be coherence. Well, I'm looking at your school schedule, there's no time for teachers to meet. So if that's not in the schedule, then that's not what you really believe. And so the school schedule really will show you what the school believes or what is most important to a school. And so I highly encourage you to look into more deeply into the Bowman and Deal 4 frames, but I always apply that when looking at school systems.
Thanks, LeBron. That's really helpful. We put this quote up from W.E.B. Du Bois because I think it really does capture this notion of school and education being not just within the classroom walls or the schoolhouse walls, is what he says. It's something outside as well as in. Education must not simply teach work, it must teach life. And that's where it brings in the whole concept of social emotional learning and thinking about all of the multiple aspects that we talk about. We want our kids to be able to graduate and be able to be successful. The next slide is just thinking about this notion of privilege and power, and the fact that with privilege and power comes responsibility. And we put a couple bullets here of just some things to think about. When in my past, one of my past work situations, I led a group, a White Allies Affinity group, to really think about what it means to be an ally to people of color. And a big part of it was understanding just what we've sort of brushed lightly on, which is the history of the system, why it's so systemic and embedded, but also to note that as a person who's white, I have privileges just by virtue of my skin color that doesn't have anything to do with anything other than how I was born. And with that power and privilege comes a responsibility for me to have an allyship with people of color to help affect change. That's something that I feel is often sort of overlooked. The other points I think are really critical around how we, as Lybroan mentioned, does the school represent the community? The school should be the community. The community should be the school. The school should be a place where the community feels welcomed, their voices, their perspectives. The other piece I think that's really important to me is also this part about history that's so missing. This we've just touched so lightly on, that's missing from our students' curriculum. Both our students of color and our white students, all students are missing a lot of history. And we as adults miss that as well, unless we made a conscious effort to understand it. So, and I do feel like leadership is everywhere. And I know one of the past webinars I was listening to, somebody mentioned that we all have to sort of think about the power that we do have, and what it means to be a leader, and looking in the mirror is a place to begin.
Yes, and I agree 100% there. In fact, when I was going back over our slides here, and it says look for the leaders everywhere, especially in the mirror, that I really advise everyone to understand your locus of control. And so a lot of times we feel powerless, but a teacher, your locus of control is that classroom.
That's right.
So in that classroom, you have the power. You can create equity in your classroom. You can determine what assignments that you give. You can determine which students are going to be in what groups, and you can make the introverted kid or the outcast kid the leader in the room. So you have a locus of control. And parents, you have a locus of control. Many times parents feel the locus of control is external. Well, it's the school, it's the administration, they control what happens. No, it's your school that your students attend. And you pay taxes, like we all pay taxes, to make sure that you get the education that your children deserve. And so in terms of locus of control, parents, you can ask your teachers questions. You can send them emails. You can ask for, I need to speak to you for 15 minutes after class. Please tell me 3 things my student can do to improve. Please tell me the 4 things that are most important for your classroom, so I can ensure that my students are doing those things. And once you have that brief conversation with the teachers, now you are empowered. Now you're a leader. Because if you ask the teacher, what is it my child needs to do to succeed? Then now you just make sure your kid is doing those things. And so you could then go back to the teacher like I would do and say, look, you told my kid they had to do these 3 things to succeed. Here's the paperwork to show my kids done these 3 things. Where's that A? Show me, because we talked, we had a conversation. So now by asking the teacher what is important to them and then making sure your student does those things, now you're even empowered more with that teacher. You have a larger locus of control. So even when we feel like powerless, you got to find your locus of control. Paraeducators, when you're working with that student one-on-one or that small group, that's your locus of control. So if something happened in the class with the teacher in a larger room and you may not agree, when you get your smaller class, that's your opportunity to correct, to provide support, to encourage, to uplift. So we all have a locus of control, and we just need to be aware of that.
So I wanted to notice that the time, we're actually 2 minutes to the end. So I'd like to ask if there are a couple people who might want to share a perspective before we do close. And I want to give Africa the last minute, the final word. But let's see if we have some more hands, because I'd love to.
Yeah, can you take Tirza for us there?
Yeah, Tirza have been having a
yes, I know.
A while, right?
Tirza in the room. There you go.
Yeah, right. No, I mean. Oh. Wait.
There she is.
Oh, there she is. Okay.
Hi. Thank you for the quick time, and thank you for this awesome webinar. This actually is kind of piggybacks on what you were sharing, Lybroan, about the locus of control. one of the things I've been thinking about is how often, as a parent, as an educator, and as a person, with an equity lens, I think about and notice what other people are doing that is harmful, what other people are doing that is wrong, or what other people are doing that is not enough. And one area of my growth, I guess, recently has been also challenging myself to notice what I am doing that is perpetuating inequity, whether that's being silent about something I witnessed or personally experienced, whether that is, noticing a bias that I am acting on and like taking steps to mitigate that when I can, whether that's educating myself or challenging myself to see something differently. I just wanted to, I guess, remind us all that another thing on our locus of control is like how we are building and modeling our own equity lenses. And none of us are immune to bias, to experiencing and perpetuating it. So all of us also have a role to like build that muscle for ourselves.
Thank you so much, Susan. Thank you for sharing that. All right, so I know we're winding up to the end here. Like I said, this will be available but I definitely want to end with Anne's quote here. So go ahead and share this one, Anne, and we'll wrap it up.
All right, so I have to say this because before the pandemic, I had the opportunity to go to the Galapagos Island and understand a little bit more about Charles Darwin. And this quote of his really resonates, and I think is something we all have to keep in our hearts and our minds as we move forward, that it's not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent, but the one most responsive to change. And that's what we're about, and that's to me, the guiding thought as we move forward through this difficult time. So thank you guys so much, Africa.
Absolutely. I mean, it's not surprising to me because I've been with you all before and it was fabulous last time and was fabulous today. Thank you so much for everything that you've shared. It's been so stimulating, so affirming also, because there's a lot of stuff that we think about regularly, and just to really be able to be in this space and share it with one another is so helpful, right? We got to support one another as we lean into transformation. So I just wanted to just like I mentioned at the beginning, I put already into the chat the link to the survey for today's session. Also, there's a link to the Ask the Experts portal if you have additional questions that you would like to submit. And then the last link is to the website where you'll be able to find the recording for today's session, and also the slide presentation where you see here that the contact information is available. You can take a screenshot if you want to kind of take it, make sure that you have it for later, or know that you'll be able to get it when you go to the website. And if you don't, for some reason, have an opportunity to click into the link in the chat, don't worry, because for those of you, like if you get into the session because you're registered for it, and you should be receiving emails about each of the sessions, and it's the same website where you go to see the session information. What you'll notice is that there'll be a shift where it won't just be the pictures of the facilitators and the description, there'll also be a link to the archive where the resources will be available. So even if you don't get the link right now, you should be able to link to it through the emails you get. And there's just all kinds of love coming at both of you through the chat. Like people just like, it's too short, it needs to be longer.
I know, and you guys are just bringing all your energy, positive energy, everybody here, all the hours, the comments and the ideas and the perspectives. Yes. And I just want to thank you all. And next Tuesday we're on again. So we're going to
please come back. Yes. Thank you all for coming this time.
Yeah, and we're going to be talking about what it looks like to really focus on kids' assets, what they bring, and how we can transform our classes through looking at what they bring. So
absolutely.
Be well. Great weekend.
Awesome.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for coming.
Next
right.
Yes. We'll see you all on Tuesday.
Yeah. Have a wonderful rest of the week and a great weekend.
Thank you.
Right, take care.
Thanks, Africa.
No, my pleasure. Seriously. Thank you.